Today I'm making scones and I'm going to start by lining the tray. You can see that I've made a template to help me line this tray. It's not essential, but it just speeds things up. I make templates for trays and tins that I use quite a lot. I line most of my trays, and particularly ones like this one that are older. I'd prefer to bake on the baking paper. Now we need to measure out 2 cups of self-raising flour. The recipe says self-raising flour, but I only have plain flour. So I'm going to make my plain flour into self-raising flour. You can see that I'm measuring out 2 cups of plain flour now. To make plain flour into self-raising flour, you add 2 teaspoons of baking powder for every 1 cup of plain flour. So here I've got 2 cups of plain flour. So that means I'll add 4 teaspoons of baking powder. And I'm sifting my baking powder because it has lumps. Next I'm adding just a little bit of salt. Now I need to rub the butter into the flour. I need to add 60 grams of butter. It's much easier to weigh the butter rather than to measure it in a tablespoon. You can see that I'm actually using a dairy-free margarine instead of butter. You can use either. So I need to reset the scales to 0 when I put the bowl on, and I do that by pressing the tare button, T-A-R-E, and now I'm measuring 60 grams of margarine. You might notice that the flour I've got here is a little darker than some white flour. That's because it's unbleached and it will taste exactly the same. So I need to rub in the butter. I avoid getting it on the palms of my hands because they're warm and we don't want to melt the butter, so I'm focusing on using the tips of my fingers. And I start by cutting it up into small pieces and coating each of those pieces in flour, because that minimizes the amount of handling with my hands, which are more likely to melt the butter. So when we're rubbing in butter, we're incorporating it into the flour without beating it or melting it. And I'm starting by just using my fingertips here quite quickly to mix it through. I'm picking up pieces of butter and rubbing them. See, the palms of my hands are staying fairly clean. We rub the butter in until it is even, and we should end up with something that looks a bit like breadcrumbs. Now we need to add the milk. We measure that in a measuring jug because it's liquid, not in a measuring cup. You can see that I am using a non-dairy milk. You can use normal milk. Don't add all of the milk at once. Save a little bit back. And then you need to mix it in quickly. And don't mix any more than you really have to. The more that you mix the flour and milk together now, the tougher your scones will be. So as soon as it's sort of mixed, I use my hands to finish. And then I'll flour the table or a board and finish pulling together the dough there. I've smoothed the dough and shaped it. And now we need to cut the scones. You can just cut squares with a knife, but I'm going to use a scone cutter or a cookie cutter. You want one that's got fairly high sides. This one's got higher sides, but I want the smaller scones, so that's the cutter I'm choosing today. I should have floured the cutter, so this scone's a little bit hard to get out. The first scones that you cut from the dough will always be the best ones, because after these ones we have to pull the dough together again and smooth it to cut the next few. You want to handle it as little as possible, because every time you handle the dough, the scones can get tougher. So for these last two, I'm not handling the dough much at all. We're just having messier scones. You want to arrange the scones in the tray close so that they rise up, pushing against each other, and don't spread out. This tray's a little bit big. So I'm going to swap them to a smaller tray so that they have sides of the tray and each other to push up against. And they fit exactly. Now it's time to glaze them. We just use the leftover milk. Just brush the tops. We avoid getting the milk on the sides because you do want a dry look on the sides, not the glazed look. And then they go into the oven, hot oven, for 8 to 10 minutes until they are just going golden on the top. While they're in the oven, it's a good time to clean up. And now the scones are ready. We can put them on a cooling rack. You don't want to leave them in the tray because the bottoms of the scones will get moist from the condensation. It's good to wrap them in a tea towel, and that stops them from drying out and keeps them warm. It's good to eat scones while they're still warm. They're not very nice left until the next day, so eat scones fresh. Scones are usually served with jam. This is rhubarb and strawberry jam. They're often also served with whipped cream, and they can be served with a pot of tea. Ready to serve.